Welcome Paul McIsaac and John Douglas to this discussion about Robert Kramer's film Route 1 USA, which is part of the VTIFF virtual cinema. I'm very happy to welcome you to this discussion. I hope people have watched the film and some may join us today. If not, this conversation is being recorded and they can watch it later without participating. Paul McIsaac started his, I should say, professional career as a radio journalist and spent a lot of time on the road interviewing people and finding stories to tell for the radio. And in a way similar to his role as Doc in Route 1 USA. Both John and Paul were very good friends of Robert Kramer, and they were all together in the late 60s in newsreel. So there is a good reason for this discussion, for the two of you to discuss. We're only sorry Robert can't be with us today as the filmmaker to talk about it himself. So we're just going to have to believe you both, whatever you say about the film. And I have a couple of questions I'd just like to kick off. I think it's true that you actually shot the film in late 1987 and beginning of 88, maybe starting in October 87. Now, what I found interesting about, one of the interesting things about the background to the film, that the money, the production money from the film did not come from the USA. It came from various European countries, which I think is important to state here because in a way it affects some of the sensibility of the film. You had a French crew with you. And so I'd like, at some point, if you could talk about that. And of course, my other question is, which I'm sure you've been asked many times, and I'm sure our viewers would like to know, is about your role as Doc, because this isn't the first time you played Doc in a Robert Kramer film. So you could talk a little bit about that and how that role evolved. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Paul, mm-hmm. If you remember anything I said, please do refer to it. If not, say what you like.
Well, hi, and hello to Vermont. And Vermont's very important to me and to Robert Kramer and to this whole history, and in many complicated ways, going back decades and decades, and John Douglas, Vermont, and Putney, and just a very rich history. Vermont is inexplicable from. It's impossible to separate our personal histories from that. So it's wonderful that that this is for Vermont viewers, so to speak. And I'll make that connection to say that newsreel, which you mentioned, New York newsreel, we were in newsreel together, and there is a wonderful documentary that is in the last stages of being completed about newsreel, again by a French group, and Robert really was a French filmmaker to a great extent, so it's not surprising. And so we were in newsreel together, and among the many films that Robert made, many of them with John, one of them was Ice, which was a really interesting film to see today. When you think about the rise of the right wing fascists or neo-fascists, when you think that there are young people on the left who are demonstrating with Black Lives Matter and who are asking themselves, should I throw this Molotov cocktail? Or why are you doing that? You shouldn't throw that Molotov cocktail. You shouldn't do that. That debate is once again, well, wait a minute, those guys have guns. Don't we have the right to defend ourselves? And those questions are as old as revolution. And that's what ICE was about. That's the question that film poses. And John and Robert and all of us in newsreel participated in not only making the film from the standpoint of the director and and the cinematographer and sound, but the actors in the film were actually members of newsreel. And recently I've had some conversation with people from that era saying how much they hated the film. They were in SDS. And I said, you know, to my knowledge, and John could correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, all the people who made the film, none of us became members of armed groups in the 60s. I mean, there may be an exception, I don't know, but it's in the sense that we made the film to say, what would it be like to say that what we need to do is pick up the gun? And we made the film, and overwhelmingly, most of us did not do that. That was the beginning of that film. Ice was the beginning of this, what is in a sense of kind of trilogy. And this brings me to Vermont, because after Ice, newsreel transformed into third rail newsreel. Many people, including John and Robert and many others, moved to Vermont, which is the connection. Robert then went on to Paris. And then there was a reunion that took place in Vermont of the Free Vermont movement, which was an extremely important movement in Vermont. And at that reunion, Robert and I met again after more than a decade, actually a lot more than a decade, and started talking about a film. And we worked together in Portugal on Doc's Kingdom and created a film about a doctor who was like us, a veteran of the 60s. We imagined that he had been doctoring in Africa in revolutionary movements. We were inspired by a number of real doctors who did that, Alan Berkman and others.
What year was this? Can I just get?
Yeah, please.
What year was that?
That was 1 year before Route 1, so that would be 86, 87.
And I believe that reunion was organized by Roz Payne, who was also in newsreel. Indeed,
that's right. The late Roz Payne, who many people in Vermont know really well. And again, when we started making the film, there was no notion of any connection to Route 1, to Ice. But in making the film, and Robert worked in a very collaborative way with his fellow filmmakers. And so we would sit and talk and think about who this guy might be. And we realized he very easily could be the character that I played in Ice. And even talked about possibly using some footage from Ice. That didn't seem like a good idea, but we did make those references. Less than a year later, after making Doc's Kingdom, Robert wanted to return to America from his own exile, self-imposed exile in Europe. He wanted to go back to America and kind of think about it. He started talking to a number of people about it, including John. And so he was Richard Copin, Film d'ici in Paris, who is his ongoing producer and cinematographer, raised the money. I love when you spoke of the fact that this was a French funded. Peugeot gave us 2 cars to drive. I mean, it was a totally French production. Pretty decent station wagons, I have to say. And so, yes, it was completely a French production. And here's this again, a connection to your introduction about me being a journalist. There was no idea that Route 1 had anything to do with Doc. Robert was going to travel down this road and meet people and find out what he found. He might see some people he knew, and it was a very vague kind of notion of a return home. And he asked me, because as you say, I was for many years then working in radio and doing a lot of interviewing on the road. Would I go out and look for people that would be interesting to talk to? And I said yes, and I went and did that. And then through some process I cannot name completely, we realized that Doc was sort of pushing his way into this, that the character of Doc made sense, that it wasn't Paul the reporter, but somehow let's bring Doc home with Robert, and let's have Doc do what John, what John, what Paul does, which is to go out and meet people and say, you know, what's up, and so we did that. And just to finish this long introduction, the French crew, which included, to some extent, Robert, but certainly Richard Copins, Olivier Schwab, the sound man, the very wonderful French crew, said, "What do you mean? What are you talking about? You're going to have a fictional character talk to people?" They're like, they said, you know, I said, you know, well, this is America. People are pretty mediated here. People understand what it means to play a role, I think, in a way. And the French were completely opposed. They thought it was a crazy idea. And of course, it worked out really well. And later they saw that it did, because what we found is that overwhelming, I actually can't remember a situation where Robert or I said to someone we met along the way, this guy over here is playing a doctor who's coming back to America to see if he can find a place to live and work. Would you talk to him? I don't remember a single person saying, that's a crazy idea, I'm not going to do that. They all said, oh, sure. They stepped right into that role. So I hope that was not too long, but responsive to your question. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, the question was like the camera crew. Who did Robert film the movie? Can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, I can.
Did Robert film that movie?
Oh yeah, he shot it all.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that was and that was an interesting, because with his Aton, he decided he would shoot it, and it was interesting to watch the gift that the cinematographer producer gave to him, to say, put the camera on your shoulder. I will worry about the lighting. I will worry about the loading. I will worry about aperture. I will make it possible for you to look without worrying about the camera. What a wonderful gift. I could see that Richard did that. And it was I mean, today we pick up our cell phone and there it is. But with that Super 16 Atom, and that's not so easy. It needs, and yes, you're right, that Robert did shoot every footage of it, as far as I know. Yeah.
May I ask a question about your, just to continue about your role as Doc, and when you mentioned how the Americans had no problem knowing that you weren't a real doctor, and still opened themselves up to you in quite an extraordinary way, something that the French most likely would not have done. When I first watched the film, I didn't know that the people in the film knew you were not a doctor, because there's no record of a conversation where you're saying, I'm actually playing a doctor.
Right.
So, and then I read more about it, and after watching the film, and I realized immediately, I watched an interview you did at Lincoln Center, and you mentioned it there.
Right.
So what that sort of made me think, isn't it interesting that in a way, the characters in the film knew that you were not really doctors, but the viewer, without reading about it, didn't know that, well, possibly didn't know you weren't a doctor, but didn't know, almost more importantly, that they did know, that the characters did know. And that creates a kind of complex viewing experience, if you think about it. There's so many objective and subjective things in it.
Well, yes, and I mean, I asked, we talked about this. It says at the beginning of the film, with Paul McIsaac. That's the only clue that there's an actor. You're right. I am a much more explicit, didactic person. I probably would have been much more thoughtful about that. But I will say that Robert was a very political person. He had a very strong political views and acted in a very principled political way. But for me, as an artist, I always understood that he was an abstract artist, that there was something deep in his relationship with communication, with presentation, with he as an abstract artist, which is how I always took him to be, he never wanted to explain. He never wanted to if you didn't, he expected you to dig deeper or to not care or to I mean, I can't explain completely the mindset of the abstract artist, not being one, but I always sensed him being that. And that he really, the question you raised, he would have said yes. Yes, so what? He would have, yeah, that's right. It was difficult for the viewer. No, well, c'est la vie. It's the only, John, what do you think?
It's really interesting hearing this side of it, because I had something to do with the film when it was being shot down in New London. And then editing for at least 2 months in Paris of the film. Looking at that footage, I have no idea of the film. I never saw it finished. And Robert having shot the film, I wasn't aware of that.
Until now.
Until now.
Wow.
No, but then I remember all sorts of material of Robert around the turtle in the highway, and you and Robert were actually talking about what you were going to do with your lives, and there was all of that, and then the balloon goes up at the end of the movie, and Robert sort of wonders about the world ahead or something, and so that's not in the movie. I mean, all of that has been recut. I mean, and I don't know when I was editing all of that material, but it was a film that we saw. So it's very hard to know where Robert was at through that process. Anyway.
So let me ask, if I might, John, does that resonate with you at all when I say that to understand Kramer's work, you need to understand that he had the aesthetic sensibility of an abstract artist?
No, I don't get that, because he was a writer. He was a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't that abstract. But this movie, the cut of the movie that I saw yesterday, was definitely abstract. And even the line that you had been a part of carrying through, that wasn't just Route 1, it was you had a connection through that movie, the one that I saw parts of or something. But all of that had been cut out. So it became really very scattered in terms of people saying, where are we? We're on Route 1, but why don't they have a sign?
Other than that, right.
But, and the next thing you'd know, you'd be somewhere else. And you weren't particularly involved with a lot of, you'd sort of say, hi, in the middle of a parking lot, you say, hi, we're in Bridgeport. And then the movie would go to talk with a policeman somewhere. So I found it really surprising. At that point, you could say very abstract. Yeah, I take that back. And then putting those pieces together, which I have no recollection. I hate to say it, but I wasn't there for that, whatever
Right.
that happened, yeah.
Now, I will say this, it is amazing to see a film made 30 years ago and think about how it seems like it could have been made yesterday.
Yeah, definitely. That was something I was going to point out when I was watching it, and I thought, well, it doesn't seem, it's not dated, which is maybe scary, maybe not. I don't know, but it seems like it could have been made today.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy that we're showing it, because I thought, this is in a way so relevant if we want to see so many different facets of America, or at least on the East Coast, East and a bit of South,
Right.
not West Coast, which is different. So, yeah, so that was a different, but can I just go back again to this
Sure.
doc role? Because I find it fascinating in terms of the experience of viewing a film and how it's structured. Because, okay, you say that you started as just being Paul when you were preparing the film or talking about it with Robert. You were just Paul McIsaac, and you were going to be a journalist finding people to interview or to show and so on. And then gradually, dialectically, as I think you once used, you decided you were going to be Doc in the film. But at some point later in the film, I assume also later in the shooting process, but who knows how it was edited, you almost really became Doc, because suddenly when you said, well, actually, I'm going to leave you,
Mm-hmm.
you decided to leave, it almost felt like it wasn't Paul McIsaac leaving. It was Doc who'd had enough or had an epiphany and wanted to go back to being a doctor or something. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, very. That's the moment in my experience. That's the moment in Georgia, I think it was, where, of course, I am an actor. I trained in improvisational theater way before this, so I brought those kind of uh, skills to bear, which is to say, I'm standing in this role, and who is this person, and what does this person believe, and not just a script that I've been given, but when confronted with this or that thing, what is this character? And so I got more and more as we went along, more and more committed to being honest to Doc, to being authentic as to what I thought Doc. And there was a moment in Georgia where I said, as you said, that this is a man who became a doctor, and a doctor like hands in the stomach doctor, like really at the edge doctor, not really needing to treat people, needing to help people, and this endless going down the road, kind of meeting people with Robert, just felt like not something that he would do. And John has referenced this. We actually had encounters where I said, this is just not what he would do, not what I think. And I abandoned Robert. I left him. I mean, in Georgia, I got up and left him, and obviously he agreed. And I flew down to Miami and started doing the research. Now I'm in the role of the reporter, I suppose, or the writer. I started saying, well, what kind of life would Doc create for himself here? Well, let's see if he can find a place to live. I found this great place on the river. And what kind of a job would he have? Well, he would go to, he would want to deal with the issue, the health issue of the day, which was HIV/AIDS and Haitian community. Gee, could he have a girlfriend? That's, so that was that role we understand where you're acting as as an author, as a creator, but you're also acting inside of a character. You're trying to say what would be true to this character we've created. And so and he just went down the road doing the Robert, what he saw, he had no idea as he went along down the road toward Miami, and when he got here, I said, "This is what I've found for Doc." And then I think it was Hoberman in his review who said he treated me just like another character along the road. You know, he said, "Here's this, here's this doctor trying to find a job. He found a job. He found a girlfriend. He found a house. Oh, good. Let's go on." And 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 I guess in a way, what I mean by abstract is that I don't think that, and in this is not true necessarily of other of Kramer's films, but in this film, I don't think he felt obliged for some kind of narrative link. He thought each beat was what it was, and if it related to the next beat, fine. If not, that's not what it's like on the road. When you're on the road, you know, is the last town you were on say something about the town you're coming to? Well, maybe it does. Yeah, maybe it doesn't. It's the road. It's the flow. Um,
And then in the section towards the end where you're missing, where you left and
yeah.
so on, we suddenly hear, maybe we heard it before, but I don't remember. We suddenly hear Robert's voice, Robert talking. It's suddenly it's the director or the filmmaker, if you like, whatever, suddenly playing the role of the journalist or the observer. So that was kind of interesting, that shift. When we're suddenly more aware of his presence.
You know, as I think about it, there's a bunch of things about this film that are kind of unique, and I've of course made an effort to see all the similar films. You know, Sherman's March, and there are other films that one could think of that where someone behind the camera goes on a journey and you know they're there and so forth. You know, Chantal Ackerman's films. There's a lot of these films, and but the one thing that I was very aware of, actually, from the beginning of my work with Robert, is that Robert and I had a very dynamic relationship. It was sometimes it was very male, you know, competitive and loving, and we always had that from the very earliest days in newsreel. But during the making of this film, I'm, you know, a student of the history of film. I was really aware of this history of the actor and the director, and that whether it's D.W. Griffith with the Lillian Gish at the beginning, whether it's Godard, whether it's you know, that's a very interesting history of the director and the actor, and who's looking at who, and when are they looking, and who's in control, and whose voice is actually, I mean, the director, of course, is always dominant. We understand, because the director at the end of the day does the cut. But the relationship that we had, I was aware even during the filming that there is this very rich history between directors and their actor that I was very sensitive. We talked about it, actually, Robert and I. It was very sensitive about that it's a very unique relationship, and can be very productive. It's sometimes, you know, superficial, of course, but so I think that our relationship in the filmmaking was really extraordinary, and that we were able to enrich each other. I mean, I know it seems a little pompous to say it, but you know, I felt like we were really part of a rich history of film, doing that, working in that way.
John, I know you worked with Robert as well on several films. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe as the three of this male trio, and there were other men, and the women were very much sort of aside in this new brave world of socialism. We won't talk about that, but
we could talk about that.
yeah. No, I was curious to know, both in terms of the two of you, John and Paul, if you had a working relationship, and Robert as well, John.
Well, Robert and I did. Paul, let's say, when would we have been working? I don't remember. ICE maybe, but other than that, I don't think no film experience like that, except Route 1, and I have no recollection of how that happened at this point. I mean, it's really, and I mean, parts of the film that I remember seeing where the two of you are on the road talking to one another. That was part of the film. But Robert and I, I think that we came together in Vietnam when we made People's War. That was the first time that we worked together, but we were working with Norm, the three of us actually.
Norm Fruchter,
right. And we came back and edited the film in Putney, in Red Clover. And it was wonderful, though. I remember Robert and I were sitting watching the rushes, and with a little something, and we were really enjoying. This was fantastic. And all of a sudden, it was clear that Norman was coming tomorrow, so we were going to have to get to work. God damn it! But the two of us just seemed very close through that process, and out of, I don't know how Milestones came together. Actually, I really don't.
Well, you should. You were the co-director.
Whenever this was, even. Oh, yeah. We wound up, okay. Robert was down in New York working on Aikido and some theater group who were going to be sort of part of some movie. And then he decided, no, we should go make a movie. Milestones, we'll drive across the country together, filming where we want to be, and then came back with David and Barbara to Boston and started shooting the movie. I mean, all of this I really hadn't thought about for a long time. It was at that point that I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
This is David and Barbara.
I couldn't hear Orly.
David and Barbara Stone you were referring to, and David Stone actually produced and supported Newsreel, if you can, yeah. And
Milestones.
Yeah, just bringing in the background for the audience.
And so we started shooting the film, which Robert had scripted quite a lot of, and very quickly it became clear that that was not going to be the movie we were going to make. It just wasn't working at all. So the two of us went for a long walk around the reservoir at some point and thought, we will start shooting these parts of people's lives as they connected and really work out. I remember, like, I can't think of the guy's name who played the son of a doctor, and we wound up sort of rewriting that scene as the time went by, but it wasn't something that we had headed for at all. So it was very loose. I mean, we really made a lot of choices, and the two of us, I felt, were just very close through that operation. I mean, and not thinking about whose role it was, kind of thing. It's really surprising. But then again, too, I was shooting the movie. I was not the writer. I was not the verbal guy in any of these projects. I was a cameraman and the editor. So, and then it's just, well, but if you're shooting the film and editing the film, there's a certain amount of control, if you will. But that worked. I mean, that really worked out well with us.
Did
And
the
then when you
two,
think about milestones, we went to the mix and we had never seen the film as a whole before. That was sort of how loose it was. I mean, we sat and chopped the film all up into little typewritten lines, had them on the floor, and re-edited the film on the floor, and then went and put that back together, went to the mix, and we hadn't seen the film until we were in the mix. But how Robert and I worked together, I just feel that was, I don't remember any problems. I don't remember saying, no, motherfucker, we're not going to do this shit. You know, I mean, it wasn't like that.
good. Did the two of you, Paul and John, ever work together on a film?
Not that I can think of.
Not in that same direct way. I mean, we worked on the same films together, but not given our different roles. We've worked on life together.
Do you want to tell more?
I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about, because you were both involved, and as was Robert, obviously, in Newsreel, New York Newsreel, about those, what is 3 or 4 years of when it, reached its peak, and then it sort of broke up and became Third World Newsreel and all that. And did Robert have a special role in Newsreel, or was everybody equal?
No. I think Norm and Robert really were leadership for quite a chunk of time through that organization. But then again, it was educated white men with money. And so that's where, I mean, Third World Newsreel emerged clearly out of that, which was very clear to folks. I mean, who's making movies? I mean, I went down to Mississippi. I'd never made a movie. There were no film schools in the country at that point. I mean, there was a film school at NYU, but that was history of film. It was not making movies. And so having never met a filmmaker before, a friend said that Norm Fruchter was bringing a film up to Bennington. I thought, wow, whoever this is, I want to go meet a filmmaker. And went and talked with him and said, I just gotten back from Mississippi. He said, well, could I come watch some of the footage? And we said, sure. And after looking at it, he said, you want to make a movie together? I said, sure. And maybe some few months after that, 6 months in that side, he said, by then I'd met Robert, because I'd been down in New York and met Blue Van Film people. And word came out that it was Artists Against the War, I think it was. And the brothers, the film brothers.
Maisel?
No.
Meisels? Meisels?
I don't think so. No, God damn it.
The Maisel brothers? No.
What's their first names?
Albert and...
Yeah. Oh, no, he's talking about...
Yeah.
You're talking about... between the two of us, we can't remember anything.
I can't believe it, but
right. The two brothers, Anthology Film Archive.
Right, we'll get it. Yeah, but they said, well, let's do a film maker.
Right. Jonas Mekas.
Jonas Mekas, yeah.
And his brother, right?
Yeah. Anyway, and so so Newsreel sort of came out of that gathering. And I remember at that first meeting, there was a woman sitting beside me with her photographic bag, with the Ross paint that had been stapled on it. So that's how we all sort of came together.
Jonas and Adolphus Mekas.
Jonas and Adolphus. And Norm and I went up to Boston and made a draft resistance film, which I think may have been the first newsreel film, actually, other than Marvin Fishman, who'd made a film at the major demonstrations in DC just before that.
Speaking of Vermont.
Yeah. I saw him the other night. And so but I was still living in Vermont. So I said, newsreel I'm down there. And I remember actually after a screening talking about they being newsreel, because I didn't see myself as newsreel at that time. It was just the group of people down there. And then after that, Norm and I went and made, with newsreel, Summer '68. And so it was through that period of time, I was editing in New York, was much closer to newsreel. And then we just finished Summer '68, and Dave Dellinger called up and wondered about whether we could go make newsreel would make a film in record Ho Chi Minh's address to the American people. And so that's when I got to know Robert, particularly because the three of us went to Hanoi and traveled to the DMZ, and then went back to Vermont and edited that film. That's what I'm saying. We stopped that when Norm got there. So, and then that was, yeah, and out of that came the collective, because then Robert said, hey, listen, maybe we should organize the state rather than New York or something like that. So it was a long period of very close relationships with those two guys before, yeah, and then Ice down there, that was, and then Weather, talking about the struggle between the armed revolution. There were the weather folks move out of SDS, yeah. So that was, I mean, you're talking about whether you're going to bomb the bathroom in the Capitol building or not. So, anyway.
It's interesting, John, that you mentioned a bit earlier that, you know, most of the newsreel people were basically wealthy white men. I'm not sure, Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that applied to everyone.
No, not
you,
at all.
including you.
Yeah, no, there was a good, like the movement in '60s, late '60s. A lot of that movement was driven by the draft, and this affected, of course, men and all men, but there were many middle class, upper middle class men who were conscious about it and who were active against it. Women, this was at the very beginning of the second wave of women's consciousness, and so women were certainly part of that. There was a struggle about that in newsreel, a very dynamic struggle from women. We had very few people of color in New York newsreel. That was not so different in some ways from today. It wasn't as if the white people in newsreel didn't want more people of color. It was just that the nature of racism and was such that it excluded people. We were certainly open to that. We made films very much for the third world community, the Panthers, the Young Lords, you know, but that was a reality. It really was a white, essentially white movement, and it is true that privilege is such that the more privilege you have, the more power you have. So yes, that's true. There were white people with less money and so forth, but it was that's not an unfair description. But I have to stand up and defend us. We did great work. We worked really well in support of and really in response in a really healthy political way with the movement of people of color, and we did that really in a great way. Some of newsreel films, I have to say, were really cracked the cement of racism. Really, there's no question about that. If you go back and look at what we were doing, it was really outstanding work about that question. So, and then it's interesting that at a certain moment, the makeup of the group was so untenable that people said, this is full of shit. And we said, you're right. You're right. Absolutely. And those of us, many of us who were in unannounced positions of power backed off and said, you're absolutely right. And that's how Third World Newsreel came about, which was to say, this is no longer that newsreel. This is now a new, and they're out there today doing great stuff and dynamic and not at all dominated by old white guys like these two bearded old white guys you're looking at. I mean, they're doing a fabulous work. It's interesting you raised that question. I've been thinking a lot about it lately, given the moment that we're in, and I'm looking back. I'm simultaneously understand our limitations, and I'm also pretty proud about what we were able to do and how we acted and how we responded to the impulse of women and who kicked our ass and really did. And you mentioned Roz Payne earlier, and wonderful women in newsreel who kicked our ass, and people of color kicked our ass, and we did pretty good.
I mean, you think of some the discussion group, whatever you call them. I mean, there'd be 30, 40 people sitting arguing the Marxist lines as it pertained to what we might do next. And it would go on for days. I mean, like some of these meetings. And it was really extraordinary. And again, I was living in Vermont, so I had sort of contact with that crew. But to come down to some of these discussions, it was like, oh my God, we're going to get through this. And then I remember one, just before Norm and I headed off to Dallas, Texas, as one of the first parts of summer '68, we waited for a day or two for this discussion of where newsreel would go. You know, it was that kind of thing. It was amazing.
Okay, can I just wanted to come back a little bit to Route 1 USA. And Kramer.
Is there anyone else out there or this?
No.
No, this is being taped, John.
It's being taped. No one else.
Okay.
Robert Kramer as a filmmaker, not so much maybe newsreel, although it came from that. It's almost, you know, what's that phrase? There's no prophet in his town, or I may be paraphrasing it.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
He was much. Really, it's when he went to France and lived in France that the French, or maybe even the Europeans, you know, hailed him as a great filmmaker. Whereas here in the US, he wasn't known. Maybe now with this, you know, restored version of Route 1 USA, there might be a few people who, and I think it's, you know, you were mentioning, Paul, earlier that you think of him more as an abstract type filmmaker. I know John didn't agree, but you said he was more a writer. I would think, I kind of see him, I mean, as an intellectual filmmaker. And in a way, a thinker, you know, intellectual. And if that's correct,
I accept that. Yep.
If that's correct, then it's sort of almost understandable that the French should admire him, because French cinema is so intellectual and worthy. Not that Kramer was a wordy filmmaker, but do you see what I mean? Cerebral.
Yes.
And poetic at the same time. So I do find it interesting. Route 1 USA, and it was a French production, and it's the French who admired him and heralded him as a big talent.
No, I think that's very insightful. I think that's a better way. And whenever if I'm ever interviewed again, I'm going to drop abstract and say intellectual. That's right. That's a very, although I have to say, for a moment, just to say about abstract, I know that the abstract movement, the painting movement, of the post-war period had a big influence on him. And I know he was very influenced by that. So I just to say that. But I think intellectual is helpful, because as an intellect, he didn't feel, even though he was working in a popular movement film, he didn't feel obliged to play by all the popular mechanisms of that. He felt as an intellectual, he didn't have to explain everything or have these neat little dramatic ties or speak to the needs of the audience for some payoff at a particular moment. And that, I think you're right. That's very much of an intellectual, and that connects him to France. I completely agree with that. I think that's right.
But the abstract is fascinating, because for me, that really explains Route One in a way that I hadn't thought about it, because it really is just splashes of this and that here and there as it sort of goes along, abstract like that, not like a clearly defined, I won't say plot, but I mean just a whole, yeah, anyway, abstract, I'll go with that, but intellectual for sure, because he was going to be a writer before a movie maker. And so the movies that he first made were all carefully written, all scripted and everything like that.
There's another element that adds to that, which is what I certainly thought was the most amazing soundtrack. I mean, beautiful, beautiful soundtrack. Not only the diegetic sounds, but the jazzy score. And I think actually it was the producer, Copin, his name was Richard Copin or Richard, I don't know. Was talking about the relationship between the jazz, I've forgotten the name of the composer.
Bar Phillips.
Right, very well known, you know. But the way the score works in the film, in a way, the film, the visuals and dialogue, if you like, is also sort of like a jazz composition. You know, there's a core, Route One is like the core tune, and everything else is just people riffing and going along and improvising in a way.
Beautiful. Well said.
No, you're supposed to.
Yes, that's totally right. Totally right. I mean, that metaphor of jazz, I mean, I usually talk about improvisation as an actor because I played Doc, but the music and the editing, finally, it does have that feeling. It has that, the elements of improvisation, the elements of following a beat, following a core, but being able to break off and have these moments that are inexplicable maybe, but somehow bringing color and different kinds of feelings. That's very much, I think, the success of that film. In fact, as I think about it, this film, Route One, he achieved that more than any of his other films. I think that this is a film in which that, whatever its success or failures, really expresses that notion of improvisation. And Bar Phillips, I know, who was the composer and musician for both Doc's Kingdom and Route One, perhaps other of his films, I'm not sure. But he loved working that way, and he loved looking at it, and just, I remember him working at the bass, on the upright bass, and just watching those images and finding where it was time for his fingers to go across the strings. It's a fabulous way of working. It just, you know, this whole process of making and being part of this film was just so extraordinary. I'm reliving it right now.
So were you in Paris when the editing took place and
No,
the
I was
score
not.
was? Oh,
No.
okay.
John was part of that.
Some of the time, right, John?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
For the last 2 months, but
right. Now,
end. I mean, I have no idea where I actually fit in through that process.
Now there is
It's
another
an
film.
ensemble.
If I can tease your audience, there is another film that if there are 5 or 6 people who are really interested in this whole conversation, there is another film which Robert made and which has been at some festivals called Dear Doc that I recommend, because what happened was during the editing of Doc's Kingdom, and I talked earlier about how I was really aware of the fact that Robert and I had this very dynamic relationship in creating both Doc and the film in some way and so forth, and that he went off to France and I had no relationship to the editing, and I said something about that. I don't know. That was back in the day when I think our conversations were mostly by fax. And so he made a film which has actually been in some festivals called Dear Doc, where he talks to me, and now he's talking to, and you raised this earlier, some combination of Paul and Doc. That's a little interesting who it is exactly he's talking to. And he talks about, we did this trip together and now I'm making this film. It's a really interesting film, a small film that he made called Dear Doc. I don't know whether John ever saw that. It's, yeah, it's a fascinating piece, and it's just part of this process of us experimenting, playing in filmmaking. I mean, in thinking about what does it mean to make a film? What does it mean to be the maker of the film? What role are you? And so I guess I'm just thinking about that because of your question.
Sounds good. I don't know if we have Bobby here, Bobby Lanahan as a guest.
Bobby. Hi,
and
Bobby.
I don't know Bobby because we're about to, unless anyone wants to add stuff, we've been here an hour and I think it's a good length. But Bobby, if you have any comments or questions or anything, do unmute yourself. You did.
You answered every question I had after I watched the movie. So, except for one, and this is a sort of trivial one, at the very end credits, it says that it was edited by Robert Kramer, amongst others. And Kija, we were just figuring out, must have been about 14 years old. And I was wondering, with the restoration of the film, whether Kija, is that where her editing came into play? Does anyone know much about what was involved in the restoration?
It's about the thing about ownership and the question of who controls restorations and ownership is very legal, and she does not. She doesn't control the film. The film is controlled by Richard Copin in Paris at Film DC, and is now being distributed. And all this revival. So no, that she's not part of that. She's a wonderfully creative, interesting filmmaker in her own right, and it's a and the ins and outs of Robert and his daughters. One of them is up there right now, living in Burlington. Yeah, is another novel.
It is
A wonderfully complex, interesting novel. But to answer your question, no, that she's not. Route One is not her film, so to speak.
Well, you did already answer my questions. The thing that I wanted to know more about was who was an actor and who was the genuine article that you were bumping into on the road. Sometimes I
Right.
really couldn't tell. But
Right.
and also how you arranged to be where you went each time. But I think it was sort of on the fly, is what I'm
It
gathering from
was.
you.
It
Yeah.
was. It absolutely was. I mean, you know, we had a few people in mind. We knew we were going to see John in Province, you know, we kind of knew we would see him. There were a couple of people, but very few.
Mm-hmm.
Most of
So
the
you just
time,
bump into this man who owns most of that city near Boston. You
yeah,
go up in an airplane with him.
yeah. I mean, you know, as a reporter, I kind of knew how to think about different people and reach out to them on the phone in days in advance to set up interviews as you would in any story. But just to paint a picture, our two Peugeot station wagons provided us. I'm sure Peugeot never got the payback they wanted, but on one of them was a bicycle, and I would get off and we would reach a town, and I'd get on the bicycle and I'd go rolling around and kind of like look for stuff. Robert, in his own way, would go walking around and look for stuff, and we would come back to the motel and we would sit down and have dinner, and Robert would eat only steak and I would eat only vegetables. And we would say, what do you got? You know, who did you find and what did you, and it's, I have to say to any young filmmakers that might be watching this, uh, it was a fabulous, fabulous way of working, to be able to just go out on the road. And if you can find a way to do that in whatever world or scene you want to investigate, to just go and not feel like you've got to have huge funding or that you have to have some script or clear, just go into a place, a town, an idea, and say, you know, what's here that interests me? What can I ask? Who can I talk to? And then just talk to them and lift up your iPhone, or I mean now you could, you know, do it and just record it and be brave about that. We were brave. We really were amazingly brave, talking to people, and that's really important. And I work a lot with young filmmakers, and that's the thing I try to talk about is like, you know, you don't need Hollywood, Zoom, Netflix. Just you need an idea.
I agree. Well, thank you.
That's a very good way to
Yeah.
end this wonderful discussion, actually. And thank you very much, Paul and John, for taking the time on a Saturday. And I'm sure everybody's hungry or thirsty or something. And
Well, I've been drinking right along, so.
that's good.
Ricky.
Okay.